So I'm hoping that you have been as disturbed, if not horrified, by some of the things going on in our country the last couple of weeks, particularly Charleston, Barcelona, Spain. And so we look at these things, we listen to the news, we read the newspapers, and I read the TH this morning at 5:30, and doesn't take much to realize there's more bad news than good news. And so you kind of wonder what to do as a person of faith. And yet what usually happens when these things come up and you're in conversations with people about them, they become a source to divide people even more, to point fingers and to make judgments about people, and then we of course wonder why we're in such a mess. So the scriptures this weekend, particularly the first reading from Isaiah and today's gospel from Matthew, I think give us a way to look at this as people of faith. I'm afraid that too many times when we have situations like this particularly come up in our country, that we like to divide along partisan lines and point fingers and do all kinds of other stuff. That is never going to solve it. And so we need to look at this as people of faith. And of course, Jesus always has an extremely countercultural approach to things because he's God and we're not. And so this first reading that we have today starts out kind of subtle. And so Isaiah is talking about this theme that we find already present in the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament as well. And it's that theme that God is about unity. God is about bringing people together. You've heard me say before, if we could put God into a gesture, this is God. This is God. Now, a lot of times we like to tell people that God does this, and God says this, and these people are. But really, if you look at the scriptures as a whole, it's about bringing people together. And if we're supposed to be following God, we're supposed to be disciples of Christ, somehow we need to figure out how we're doing that ourselves. So that's why in this reading from Isaiah today, we hear this quote, "And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, ministering to him, loving the name of the Lord, and becoming his servants, them I will bring to my holy mountain, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." So God really doesn't care from whence you came. It's about what direction you're headed. And so we need to keep that as a guiding principle in what's going on. And that gives us a great introduction to the second reading today because, okay, so we have Paul. Now remember, Paul was not a Jew. He was apostle to the Gentiles. And so this reading that we have today is very interesting because Paul is saying, in effect, you know what? I would give my faith up if it meant that other people would get to heaven. That's how much he was concerned about others. And then he went a step further. He said, in a sense, he said, I want to live my life in such a way that makes it so attractive that people will come to God. Instead of saying, well, them people over there, they shouldn't be here, and these people over here, they don't deserve to exist, and having all these divisions, Paul said, I want to be so damn attractive that people won't be able to stand not being a part of us. Now, there's a challenge. But then it brings us to today's great gospel from Matthew. And again, this is where it's really important for us to be people who study the scriptures and not just kind of take them at face value. So we got this great story about the Canaanite woman. So a few background things you need to understand to take away why this is so important. The gospel starts out by saying Jesus retired to the area of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were about as pagan of a territory as you could get. They were not very welcoming to Jews at all. So the fact that Jesus was showing up on somebody else's turf is very interesting. He could have gone a lot of other places. Okay, so that's the first thing. Jesus was, to use last Sunday's phrase, getting out of the boat. He was taking a risk, okay? Then we hear about the Canaanite woman. The Canaanites were really hated. Okay, so they didn't get along at all with these folks. And so not only was this woman a Canaanite, the biggest sin was she was a woman. And you have to understand that in this time and in this culture, women never spoke to men in public. Stop smiling, guys. Women never spoke to men in public. And so she's standing off at a distance. Jesus is over there, and she goes, Lord, Son of David, help me, my daughter's tormented by a demon. So not only do they not supposed to talk to people in public, but she used a 4-letter word, Lord. That was not from her faith tradition. She knew that was a loaded word for the Jews. And so she put herself into that, and she called him Lord. And so then you have the knucklehead disciples. So Jesus didn't even respond to her. Did you notice that? Have pity on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter's tormented by a demon. But he did not say a word in answer to her. He ignored her. At least he seemed to ignore her. So the disciples came up, and of course they're embarrassed. And so the disciples have weaker faith than most of us at times. And so they go, get her out of here. She's an embarrassment. She's causing a scene. You know, we like to have everything really safe and peaceful and on the up and up, okay? And he says to them, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, I don't know if they knew what that meant at that point in time. But he kind of said, I came to gather folks together. I didn't come to run around with the sleek and the strong. So that's fine, except the next thing that happens is a big problem. The woman, instead of being a long ways away, she comes right up to Jesus, does him homage, which is a sign of respect. So she bows in front of him and says, Lord, help me. Now he's got to deal with her. She's right in front of him. And she has broken every rule, every societal rule that you can do. Lord, help me. And what's he say? It says, he said in reply, he doesn't say to her, but he just said out loud, it's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. Now, I am sure that this gospel was the first time that I paid attention at Mass when I was growing up. I remember Monsignor Ament with his big hairy fists up in the pulpit saying that. It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. And I thought, Jesus is such a snot. If your mother was there, you wouldn't talk like that. And so I remember early on in my career paying attention. I thought, boy, this just doesn't make sense. And so that's when it gets really interesting. So the woman says, she was a smart cookie and a woman of deep faith. She says, please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters. And now the scripture says very specifically, Jesus said to her in reply, oh, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. Now, what can we take away from that for us? Because Jesus had that conversation, said that snotty phrase for the benefit of the disciples. Of course, if that woman had been really thin-skinned and not have a lot of faith, she would have run off with her tail between her legs even if she didn't have a tail. So what do we do with this, and how does it help us out? Well, this is the thing. Christ, in Christ there's not color, there's nothing but person, because we're all created in God's image and likeness. Even the worst people that you think of in the world, they're still made of God's image and likeness. They made to brush up on it a little bit. But if we believe what the scriptures say at all, that's the truth. So as we look at these situations in our world where there's racism and discrimination and all these kinds of oppression that's going on, we have to figure out, instead of coming to some economic answer for these things or political or pointing fingers at people, we need to say, all right, what is Christ calling us to in this situation? And if you add to this craziness that's going on in our world something as ridiculous as white supremacy, and white supremacy is being touted by people who profess to be Christians. And I would love to talk to them. They'd probably kill me, but I'd love to talk to them. You know why? Because I need to remind them in the scriptures that Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew. He did not look like anybody else in this church. And so when people are talking about white supremacy and they're standing on the Bible for it, they better get off. Because he didn't look like any of us. Now, this is the deal, folks. You and I have been raised in a culture that say there's two things we don't talk about in public. Politics and... And it's killing us. It's killing us. Oh, we don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable, or, well, I can't do anything about that. And it's killing us. And we can't afford to do that any longer. You know, we as Roman Catholics are the largest single denomination in this country. We used to be easily over 25%. That's starting to go down now. About 23% by what I can tell now. But we're still the largest single denomination. And as I've said to you before, if we'd pull up our big boy pants and stand up for our faith, that our country would be a different place. But in a country founded by our Protestant brothers and sisters on religious freedom, we have worked so hard to be like everybody else. We are now. We are. We're not making a big difference at all. We could, but we don't. And I liken it to that example. You've heard it before. You know, you get a pot on the stove, a hot oil, like you're going to deep fat fry something, you throw a frog into it, and it jumps out. But if you put the pot on the stove cold, and you put the frog in, and you turn it up little by little, the frog never knows what hits it. Folks, that's where we're at today, in my estimation. The temperature is rising little by little by little, and we are clueless. And so we point at somebody else, and this leader or that person and that stuff that's going on. But what are we doing in our hearts, in our homes, in our churches, in our towns, in the places that we work at? Are we avoiding these same kinds of things when somebody goes off half-cocked and talking about stuff instead of saying, you know, I think you're oversimplifying this. I think that there's probably more than one side to this. This is the age of messy conversations. We can't afford to shut up. And I really think that that's what Jesus is going to ask us. You know, on the final day, he's not going to say, well, now, let me see, which of the 10 Commandments were you good at? 4, 6, 9, 8, you better watch out about, you know. Or is he just going to say, okay, what did you do? The song that we sang in the 60s, whatsoever you do to the least of my people, that you do unto me. What did you do for me? And it's so easy for us to get caught up in our own lives, do our own thing, and not worry about all this other kind of stuff. And the reason that you and I were put on this earth was not to pad our own selves. The reason that we're here is to make a difference in the world. Jesus called us to transformation. He called us to transformation. And yet the temperature's going up and up and up. We're uncomfortable. I hope you're uncomfortable. You better be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not paying attention. But it's going up, little by little by little. And we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. In fact, we shouldn't think about it very long. We just need to start doing something. But we do so many things that kind of dismiss this, you know. So the things that our country was founded on, and the things that really hold us together, the tenets of our faith, you know, we're not making those sacrifices for. We say, well, you know, we are at church a couple times this month. God understands if we don't go today. Or we schedule all kinds of kids' athletic events and stuff on Sunday mornings instead of going to church. Why do you think we have kids growing up who don't have a moral compass? Because we're saying, oh, this is just like everything else. It is not. Wrestling and soccer are never going to get you to heaven. They're great things. There's nothing wrong with them. But somehow, God has to come number one across it all, period. And so we shouldn't be whining and sucking air and, oh, I don't know, when we're kind of caving into this stuff all the time. So I think this is a crucial time for us. I'm not a naysayer. I still believe that God's in charge. But God's in charge because we are His arms, His hands, His mouth, His feet. That's us. So I'm always interested when people say, well, you know, God, I don't know how God lets these things happen. I say, well, what are you doing about it? And you get that deer in headlight look. So I think it's a crucial time for us to be looking clearly at these issues and saying, what am I in my own little world, in my own little circle? What can I do about that? Because the temperature is going up. It's not going down, it's going up. And if we don't do anything, we're going to wind up boiling in our own oil.